Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gabe Tylov. I'm the Associate Director of Adult Education and Community Outreach here at Phipps Conservatory, and I will be your moderator for our fourth and final session of the afternoon, which is Access to Nature. Our first speaker is Dr. Katilyn Mascatelli. She is the Ecopsychology research scientist here at Phipps Conservatory, where she studies people's attitudes about carbon-saving actions. Katilyn received her PhD in social psychology from Carnegie Mellon University, where she studied how gender and race stereotypes impact employment outcomes, as well as social factors influencing adjustment to type 2 diabetes. Her current research investigates people's emotional reactions and general response to information about high-effort, high-impact individual actions to reduce one's carbon footprint. Please welcome Dr. Mascatelli.
Thank you. I'm going to lower this just a smidge. Thank you. Welcome back to the afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to be following that great session just prior to this. I'd never felt so transcendent and yet grounded at the same time. And so what I'm going to be talking to you about today is going to be a little bit more on the grounded end of things. We're going to get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of ecopsychology and our methodologies that are commonly used. So just to give you a brief overview of my talk today, I'm going to be discussing with you, highlighting the benefits of nature. Let me make sure I have my notes. Great. And then I'm going to get into operational definitions of both nature and the health benefits that nature purportedly gives people. And by operational definitions, I mean things like, how do we define nature? How do we define health on the ground among people who are trying to measure and assess the impact of those things? Then I'm going to go into some methodological considerations, and we're going to talk a little bit about control groups, which is always fun. And then finally, we're going to end with some opportunities and research gaps that can be addressed. So moving on. So here is the non-exhaustive list of all of the health and well-being benefits that the literature supports for nature contact. And you see that I have a list of physical or physiological benefits, and then I have a list of psychological benefits. I'm going to focus more on the psychological benefits ends of things. I think people pretty easily understand the physical benefits aspect, but when it comes to psychology, for some reason, because you can't necessarily always directly observe it, it gets a little hairier in thinking about what it actually means. So now let's get into what are the operational definitions of some of these psychological benefits. So first, in the happiness or well-being literature, we kind of classify the benefits into two camps. We have the hedonic well-being, which is simply how good do you feel right now, what is your life satisfaction, and those can incorporate things like self-reported mood, we have self-reported life satisfaction, and we also operationalize it as the absence of the negative states or the negative moods. So I'm not feeling distressed or depressed. Then we have our eudaimonic happiness, which is a little bit more of what we were talking about earlier, this feelings of vitality and transcendence that nature can give you. And those are usually also self-reported. In terms of cognitive benefits, we usually define cognitive benefits on the ground as what are your scores on tests of working memory and attention. We also typically see things like response times used. So how quickly are you able to think of a fact or respond in real time to a task? Next, we have our stress outcomes. So we have a whole host of physiological ways to measure stress, such as cortisol levels, heart rate variability, those things. We also have more psychological aspects, so self-reported stress. So currently, how stressed are you on a scale of 1 to 7? We also have people list their life stressors or go through a checklist and say, how many of these stressors have you experienced in your life? So that is another way to measure stress. And then finally, we have prosocial behavior and social connectedness. And in particular, prosocial behavior is kind of difficult to measure. Sometimes you can measure it experimentally just by seeing, if somebody is in distress, will this other person help them? That's considered prosocial behavior. We also have more in the lab kind of ways to measure it, where we ask people, we give them these elaborate moral situations that don't have a clear-cut black and white right or wrong answer, and we have participants write down what they would do in that situation, and later those responses are scored and rated for exactly how prosocial they seem. In terms of social connectedness, these can be things like self-reported feelings of connection. So again, usually we use a lot of Likert scales. So on a scale of 1 to 7, how socially connected do you feel? Or we can be a little bit more literal and we can ask people, how many friends do you have? How many different organizations are you involved in? And we infer, the greater number of close friends that you have, the greater number of organizations, the more embedded you are in your community and socially. So those are just a couple ways to operationally define these constructs. Now I'm going to give you a quick case study so I show you a little bit more what we mean. So here's a study that was done in 2015 by a Spanish researcher, and he looked broadly at 7 to 10-year-olds and their cognitive skills, and they found that children who lived closer to green spaces had greater development or greater increases in their cognition. So that's great. We should all, tell the children to live near green spaces, right? But the question remains for psychologists or for you as a layperson perhaps trying to interpret this is, what do they mean by cognition? Well, in this case, the scientists mean working memory and attention. So we're defining cognitive development as changes in your scores on a test of working memory and changes in your scores for a test on attention. So once again, we ask, what are those tests looking like? Well, let me give you a brief example. So working memory is assessed by a very standard test called the N-back test. And N is a stand-in for a number, and so it can be the 2-back test, the 3-back test, all the way up to, I don't know what the highest they've ever done is, but I'll give you an example here, and we're going to play along. I'm going to flash a screen with a series of numbers on the screen to you, and I'm going to tell you we're playing the 2-back test today. And so as I flash these numbers, on the third number, you're going to tell me what number showed 2 numbers ago. And then on the fourth number, 2 back from that one. And so this is a test commonly used to assess working memory or short-term memory. So let's practice. We have 8 as our first number, 3, 5. So what is the answer for 5? 8. Correct. 3. Good. 5. Very good. Oh, you guys all got a perfect score. Wonderful. So if you can imagine doing this as a child, maybe as a 7 to 10-year-old, this is probably a pretty difficult activity to do. And certainly for adults, they escalate the difficulty in making it 4 back, 5 back. So those are the scores for working memory. Oh, there was one more number. Look. All right. And then in terms of attention, attention is defined as your score on this attentional network task for children. And this is pretty simple. Children are shown an image on a screen of several fish, and they're asked to attend to or to pay attention to the fish in the center. And they're going to report which direction, left or right, the fish is facing. Now in this trial, all the fish are congruent. They're all facing the same direction, so it's pretty easy to report they're all facing left. And so you can imagine through other trials, they vary which direction the fish on either side are facing. You're supposed to ignore that as a child. Pretty difficult task with all these shiny fish. And you're supposed to report which direction they're facing. So again, these are the ways that researchers actually operationally define working memory and attention in children. And so the important thing to note is that these benefits of nature that these researchers found hold across things like socioeconomic status, because they controlled for that, and other variables. But it's always important to remember that these tests were developed by psychologists in probably typically white Western cultures. And so the way that they think, what is the best way to measure cognition, or what is the best way to measure memory, this is the best that they could come up with. But certainly we know that there are many ways that cognition can manifest itself. And so if you're trying to think very critically about it, you can think, well, how can we translate this performance on this specific task to nature? And that's kind of where we're trying to bridge the gap here. But these are the best ways that psychologists usually know how. now talk about operational definitions of nature. And last night, Dr. Kondo spoke a little bit about this. So there are many ways that we can operationalize or define nature. In terms of observational studies, we have a lot of continuous ways. So we have satellite imagery in which, they kind of take pictures of the ground and they measure. They take these little squares and they measure the light reflecting off of the little squares and assign it of greenness, essentially, value. So that's one way that we can measure greenness. We can also measure distance to green space. And so this is measured in feet or miles, right? And how far are you from a park or a green space itself? That is also continuous. In addition, we have some more binary or categorical variables, so simply the presence or the absence of plants in a room. We also have other categories such as land use categories. So this chunk of land is farmland, this chunk of land is urban, this chunk of land is forest. And so these are ways that a lot of observational studies measure greenness or nature, right? And then in terms of experiments, I am a bit more versed in experimental design, and so what we usually do is pretty similar. We chunk people into different categories, we randomly assign participants to experience different levels of nature, and we compare between categories, right? I'll talk a little bit more about a good example of an experiment later on. But in terms of these definitions of nature, these operational definitions, we can wonder, how well do they capture exactly what we're talking about, right? And so this is a really great graphic here that shows that these definitions of nature can vary along a couple of dimensions. So the vertical dimension is spatial scale, right? These can be, nature can be this huge, all-encompassing thing, or it can be very small, right? It can be a potted plant that's on your table here, or it can be the entire Amazon forest, right? And so you have variations in spatial scale. And then along the bottom axis here, you have variations in frequency. So how often are people coming into contact with nature over time? How big of a scale is it? So you can imagine with a lot of these satellite imagery, these measures of greenness, these are typically used like near where people live. And so you can imagine they encounter these environments pretty frequently, but the spatial scale can vary quite a bit, whether it is you're just walking along your driveway to your car, or whether you're fully going to be immersed and surrounded by nature. And so there are a couple of additional issues with this, including dosage, right? These don't necessarily always capture the same amount of dosage. Does this mean that you have to go outside for 2 hours a week, or do you have to, live outside and really and become integrated into that environment? We don't know based on these definitions, right? An additional issue is this inability to capture ranges of experience. And so a lot of the times with categorical measures, they'll ask, have you been to a national forest in the past year? And if you check yes, all those people who checked yes are essentially treated the same. But some people go to their national forest and they drive around and they kind of look out the window at the forest. And some people go to their national forest and they go camping, or they go out and they take off their shoes and they walk around, right? So there are these different levels and depths of experience that something like that doesn't necessarily capture well. And finally, there's this question of mechanism. And mechanism means, how do these effects happen? Mechanism asks, what is the intermediate step from being in nature to experiencing these benefits, right? There has to be something in the middle that we capture. And so the wide variety of benefits that nature can give to you, as we talked about earlier, suggests that there are probably multiple mechanisms at work here, right? And so our issue as scientists is to figure out which mechanism goes to which relationship, right? And so for this first relationship, we say, nature improves cognition. Well, what is the intermediate step in between there? And so a lot of people have hypothesized that the attention restoration theory, which says that paying attention to nature involves a lot of bottom-up processing, where you're focused on kind of the soft fascination with lower-level features, and that lets your top-down processing, the little executive director that lives in your head and directs your life for you, that gives him time to rest and restore. And so that hypothesis says that these bottom-level features allow you time and rest. And that is what gives you the benefits in cognition, that you have a well-rested executive director up there. And then when he gives you that memory test later on, you're able to be really good at it, right? So that's one theory, and it's actually pretty well supported in the literature. What about social cohesion, though? Does attention restoration theory explain the benefits of social cohesion? Maybe. It's certainly possible that if your little guy is more well-rested, he'll be more friendly, I guess, to other people. But it's also possible that it could be very literal, right? The more you're in nature, the more friends you have, maybe the more empathy you have for other people. So there are definitely mechanisms within that could explain it. Or it could also be less literal, right? The more nature that you're around, the more that you perceive the social community around you to be positive. And finally, stress reduction. So similarly, the attention restoration theory could help with your stress. It could be simply distracting for you, so you don't have to pay attention to the stressors in your life. Again, this exercise just shows that there are many mechanisms, many ways in which nature could be beneficial. So let me talk a little bit more about the nitty-gritty here, which is control conditions. And I know I don't have a lot of time here, but we're going to talk about how control conditions are used to compare and contrast the benefits of nature. And so in experimental research, it's always very important to have a strong control condition so that you can tell what is the effect of your intervention compared to either business as usual, maybe in this case, no nature, or being in a room, and that way you can be more confident that any changes that you see are due to the thing that you changed in the experimental condition. So it's important to identify appropriate control conditions, right? And a couple of issues as you're trying to figure out, like, what do we compare this to, revolve around simplicity versus real-life accuracy. So on one hand, you want your control to only differ in like one key element from your experimental condition. But on the other hand, that might sacrifice a lot of real life, how it applies to your real life. And so as you can see here in this example, this is a real study that was done, and they had elderly people sit and observe a potted money plant in the experimental condition for 5 minutes, and in the control, they had them observe just the empty pot. And so on one hand, this has, right? And so on one hand, this is incredibly tightly controlled experimentally, right? The only thing that changes is the fact that there's a plant in that pot. On the other hand, it's not really externally valid or what happens in real life, right? You don't really sit and stare at an empty pot for 5 minutes. And so they did find benefits in terms of their blood pressure reactivity, but we want to ask ourselves, is this a very useful control? And some might say it's not. Yes, and so there are issues with practicality and conceptual designs when you're trying to figure out these control conditions. I want to tell you briefly about a study that I thought did a very good job of this. This was a study that was done recently trying to understand virtual reality and how experiencing nature in virtual reality versus in person can offer benefits. And the main outcome in this study was actually creativity. And so they had, this is a factorial design where you see there are 4 blocks in which people are sorted into. And so on the left here is the virtual reality condition where people just wore this headset and either experienced outside or a natural or an urban environment. And then there's the in-person condition where the people actually walked around in those environments. And so what they found is very interesting. So in the virtual reality condition, being in nature in virtual reality was found to have superior benefits for your creativity. However, in the in-person condition, they were actually equal. And so, one could say these are both outside, right? You're either outside in an urban environment or outside in a natural environment. But it's always important to have an appropriate control or comparison condition. And I will say that overall, the people in person in either environment had higher scores of creativity than the people in the virtual reality. Oh, there we go. So I have a couple opportunities for us moving forward. So I think it's really important to understand how scientists operationally define these constructs. If we're going to make prescriptions about how people should experience nature or what benefits that they could gain from them, it's really important to be very specific and to understand exactly what we're talking about. Are we talking about trips to the rainforest, or are we talking about staring at a plant on a table for 5 minutes, right? So those are pretty important. Finally, it's important to seek and understand the mechanisms, right? Again, we need to understand the how in order to understand what to tell people or what to advise people. And lastly, it's important for us to understand those control conditions or those contrast conditions. All of this is really just to say that if we want to make scientifically grounded recommendations or talk to people about the experiences of nature and kind of cite all these studies, it's really important for us to understand both the benefits and the drawbacks or the limitations to those studies. Thank you.